Welcome to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. Join your hosts, Anita Russell, Mavis Bauman, and Gail Hunter, as we create a brave space for conversations about racism, personal transformation, and accountability. Conversation provides a means to dive deeply into your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs and examine what emerges in your words, actions, and behaviors. The show is a journey towards anti-racism by cultivating change within yourself first and then out into the world. Learn to engage in racial dialogue using 4 tools: courage, conversation, relationship, and accountability. Discover how truth, reconciliation, and healing can emerge from honest and deliberate conversations. Manifest social change right now on Inflection Point Podcast. So if you joined us in our last session, you know that we had this really incredible discussion centered around racism as a disruptor of health and wellness in mind, body, and spirit. And so this time, for this episode, we're continuing that same conversation. And our question is, what would it take to live a good life and create a vibrant society? So I'm going to start out by giving just a quick recap of some of the things that we shared last time. We presented a lot of information from a 2017 publication called Communities in Action, Pathways to Health Equity. And we talked about 9 social determinants of health that this publication actually identifies. We talked about 3 of them last time, and this time we're going to talk about a number of them as well: physical environment, social environment, transportation, and education. And some of the key takeaways in this particular publication are: health equity is crucial to the well-being and vibrancy of communities. Social inequities matter more than healthcare in shaping health disparities. Health equity holds benefits for the entire nation, from economic vitality to national security, and communities have the power to take steps towards health equity. So we're going to jump into our conversation at this point, and we're going to pass the mic. I always mess that up. Pass the mic over to Mavis, and she is going to lead us in a discussion on social determinants. I'm sorry, social environment. Excuse me.
Well, I just have to say that I love that word vibrant, the vibrancy of a community. It just kind of sets up an image of a place that's alive and not just existing. So I'll just read quickly the definition from the Communities in Action document of social environment. It reads like this: the social environment, sometimes referred to as social capital, reflects the individuals, families, and businesses within a community, the interaction and kinship ties between them, the norms and culture. It also includes social networks and trust, as well as civic participation and willingness to act for the common good. So that's a good high-level definition of social environment. And today I just wanted to kind of share my thoughts about what a social environment is to me and what I've seen as I've traveled and studied. I've been thinking, a lot of this is going to be my own opinion, some statistics in there, but I've been thinking about my own community and what I want from it and why I live here. I saw some research based in British Columbia from the Chief Minister of Health there that says people who are socially disconnected are less likely to receive help from others, which could make a critical difference in times of crisis or emergency. And that's a really basic underlying reason for us to be connected. And it seems to me that it's the connectedness that makes the community. I was listening to someone from this group speak about connectedness, that connectedness has to be healthy as well. Not just knowing each other, it has to be a positive relationship. So I think that, if it's a positive relationship to each other, it leads to trust in the community and then how the community functions. Yeah, as you know, or may have heard before in our podcast, I'm doing some work in Rwanda, and I really sense how differently we function with each other when I watch my Rwandan friends. I read that about 50% or 124 million American adults are single living alone. And in Rwanda, the average household has 4.3 people living in it. There's a completely different way of relating to each other. You might have heard the term too, Ubuntu. It's Ubuntu. It's a Bantu term in Africa, which generally means humanity. Sometimes we've heard it described as I am because we are, or I am because you are. Again, it describes a certain relatedness that I don't know, I just don't think that Americans run on that sort of software. In the philosophical sense, though, Ubuntu is the belief in a universal bond of sharing that connects all humanity. And I love that because that's really what we're trying to foster here in Inflection Point too. This is not about any one group, it's all of humanity and how we can relate to each other. I was thinking about how, in relation to that term Ubuntu, how I am because you are, Americans kind of tend toward I am because I can do it myself, or I am because I made money doing it. And this affects so much about our social environment, where money is poured into in terms of architecture, the layout of cities. We were looking at some pictures the other day as we were in our meeting, and I happened to show Anita and Gail this photograph of this place. I think it was in Rio, Brazil. Just series of high rises, like probably, I don't know, I would say at least 80 to 90 floors clustered together. And the term Anita uses for living together this way is like file cabinet homes, just these tiny places. And I wonder what the effect is of that sort of living structure on their social environment. That's kind of colored by the fact that I believe in living close to the earth, but still, are they getting to know each other? It seems like even in New York, the more densely you're pushed together, the less we know each other. I never knew my neighbors in New York City, but I know them all here in a small town. So I wonder what the effect of that is. But I think the other thing that is common where there's a vibrant social environment is just respect for the integrity of the community. We were talking about, the effects of gentrification, investment in areas that, oh boy, everybody thinks they're run down. There may still be a vibrant social environment there, even though it's not a wealthy community. And it seems to me that what we need to watch for is, how do people relate to each other? Do they have what they need? Can they walk to the grocery store and get fresh food? Can they greet each other? Are they encouraged to come out of their houses? And instead of saying, I could make a lot more money off of this piece of land, what about investing in the structures the local community has already conceived? I just love that idea of letting people live how they want to live together and encourage it and help it to be healthy ways. So some of the things that I think make for a healthy social environment is people need places to gather. There used to be, I think in most European cities and in some cities in the States, a town square where if you wanted to just walk, greet, have a cup of coffee, you knew exactly where to go. You would be around people. You didn't necessarily have to interact, but someone would greet you and say hello. We have kind of lost that in the States, and I'm hoping it's coming back, although it's a little more contrived than something that, builds itself more organically. The other thing is just proximity. I live in a community where there's still a car in most driveways, so we're not walking past each other all that much. However, there is a lake here and a boardwalk. Even that encourages people to come out of their houses, and that's how we can socialize. So that proximity to each other, that you can get to each other on foot and greet and get to know each other. When you go through that, you start knowing your neighbors and you're able to care for each other. You start to know the kids in the neighborhood. I'm sure that, both Gail and Anita have lived in communities where everybody knows the kids and the kids are outside playing unsupervised. Well, we confess that we all grew up that way. We were all free range chickens. And, it's so lovely to have the adults kind of circle around with watchful eyes and make sure the kids are safe. To me, that's another great feature of a healthy social environment. Also the kind of the freedom to develop and improve your own physical surroundings in a culturally relevant way. So if you, let's say you want to have a, what do they call them? A garden that's like right in your front yard. Why not? Why not? We shared a story of our little gardener in Georgia the other day. It brought people together. It brought food, fresh food for people who didn't have anything, or couldn't get to stores. So I just think that freedom is critical. Instead of, dictating the color of a house or the way a yard is landscaped or something, there needs to be freedom of expression, with respect to each other. I mentioned a little bit about gentrification. I think, most of the stories I've heard are very sad, how they displace people of certain socioeconomic brackets. I always say, I couldn't buy my house again. The way prices have increased because of rebuilding in my area, it's made my home unaffordable. And it's much worse for people in, more urban areas that have been invested in less. And I would love to see some entrepreneurs say, how can we improve the safety, the quality, the cleanliness of this area without disturbing its culture and its people and its social environment? I think too, there should be equal access to stores, restaurants, theaters, libraries. We were talking about how much libraries can teach the kids in a community, parks, ways to be active, programs that bring people out of their homes. And also a traffic-free place for kids to play. Kids just need to run around. They need to be on the earth. They need to play in the grass and play with mud and climb a tree. And they need to be safe. So that to me would, that would have an effect on their psychological development, on the stress levels for their parents, and a whole host of things. And of course, close access to healthcare for everyone. This research I was mentioning earlier in British Columbia talked about if people did not have connectedness with others, they felt alone in the world, they were more likely to go to use healthcare services, adding to the burden of the costs of healthcare. When if they had a neighbor who said, can I bring you a cup of tea or go get the aspirin for you? Maybe they wouldn't have had to go, get in a cab or call an ambulance or something. I thought that was kind of interesting. Also, pride in a community, the desire, the common desire to care for it, I think makes for a good social environment, like a community garden. Or, just if something's on the street, that sense, this is my place, I'm going to pick this up. We're going to all work together to keep this clean. And then I've heard of, really healthy communities having activities for people of all ages. This is another thing, I think a common theme in Africa is you do not separate from the elderly. And you share child rearing with family members. And I just think about how much we have to teach each other if we could stay together in that social environment. I know there are a lot of reasons we can't, but let's entertain the idea anyway. Let's see what else I have here. Also, town support for that social environment. Make sure that the garbage is collected. Make sure that water is flowing and it's clean. All those affect how people feel about the social environment they live in. And let's see what else. I read this book a number of years ago by Bill McKibben. I picked it up because it is about the environment and how we can live more peacefully with our environment. And he did some research. He went to 4 different cities to find out what was going well in those cities. And I've got to look at it a little more. Maybe we can talk about it more later. But the thing was that these cities individually had solutions for themselves that were unique for that city. And they tended to be very simple. They didn't necessarily need to be high tech. I know one, they were trying to design a bus that would stop at certain stops. And then they figured out just to paint a line on the street and the bus would stop when it saw that, So just very simple solutions. One was all the kids ride free. I mean, can you imagine just moving kids around safely, how that would be? The way he compared it, it was just so informative, and how we can live more happily together and respecting our environment at the same time. Because without the environment, what have we got, folks? I did want to share a quote from him. He said, Bill McKibben again, he says, "I remember over and over again in Kerala in India, where the transit chief explained that his city public is more important than private." So if you put public needs over private needs, I mean, how much that would change our decision-making. He also said that in Kerala, the key to progress is raising the poor majority and not the rich minority. So that, ties in with the gentrification things I talked about. And let's see here. He says, we just need to get a deeper understanding of how it is that we want to live together and stop isolating from each other and from our environment. And that even though Americans, as we know, have about everything they need, they are the least happy of the countries. So it's not that consuming space, resources is the road to happiness. It's how we relate to each other and how safe we feel. So that is my description of a lovely social environment. Do you all have any questions for me or ideas?
Yeah, I have a couple of comments, actually. I like the way you framed that up, particularly just mentioning some of the things that in terms of the way we grew up. And free range chickens, I've never heard described exactly in that way, but that's exactly what we were. You had triggers during the day, like you had that trigger that said it's time to go home and eat some lunch, or that trigger that said it's time to go home and eat some dinner, or that trigger when the street lights came on, and then that's when, and everybody had the same triggers for the most part, right? So it's just really different how our social environments, I don't even know that I would actually use the word evolved, because in a lot of ways it feels like they have de-evolved and just into this space of disconnectedness and all of that. And the other thing I would mention is how differently people are connected to one another than when we were growing up.
Mhm.
We had like this one particular area that I grew up in, Homestead, Pennsylvania. And one of the really cool things about growing up in Homestead, Pennsylvania is that each neighborhood had like a specific playground that we went to, and we had all kinds of activities and things like that that would be planned for us throughout the course of the summer. In our particular neighborhood, we played on a street called Dixon Street. And next to our the main area and the playground and everything was a set of apartment buildings. And a lot of our friends actually lived in that one of those apartment buildings. But we also, there was a woman that we endearingly named Miss Grouchy, because Miss Grouchy was always the one that was telling us, don't do this and don't do that. And, but you knew not to be disrespectful to her, but she was just, she kind of lived up to that name. So if you could imagine the day when my brothers and I walked in the house and Miss Grouchy was sitting in our living room, we knew right away somebody was in trouble. We didn't know which one of this it was, but one of us was in trouble. But just the fact that she came to our house, and some maybe about today people would say she was a busybody or whatever, but at the same time she carried an air of respect, because even though we didn't like her, we never disrespected her. And so it was just really shocking when we came home and
She helped raise you a little bit, right? I mean,
in a sort of distance kind of way, because she was just one of those people in the neighborhood, in the community, that you just didn't disrespect. You paid attention to her because she would go home and tell your parents if you were misbehaving or anything like that. So the point I'm making is, when you're drawing some of the distinctions between culture here and culture in some of the places that we've both been to in Africa, it's very different. Mm-hmm. It's very different in that whole sense of community, and even the way we were welcomed in their community.
Yes,
was pretty amazing and worthy of speaking of.
Absolutely.
And I think we're just in an odd kind of place in the United States. So the bottom line for me, and then I'm going to shut up and let Gail talk, but the bottom line for me is that so many people out there don't really realize that when we talk about racism is a disruptor of health and wellness, it doesn't just disrupt the health and wellness of Black people or people of color. White people are impacted as well. And particularly when it comes to those limitations of proximity and getting to know people that are different from you, and all of that. So creating this vibrant society that we're talking about that for everybody. And so then health equity becomes a shared vision and a shared value. So it's not just isolated to one particular group of people, it's everybody.
Good point. Good point. With, just one extra thought here, what COVID has revealed in terms of our social environments, that if people are not connected, and they'll act out in ways like during COVID by not trusting their institutions and hoarding toilet paper and having mask-free parties, and that there's a break there. There's a break there. And I learned a lot during COVID. I didn't know I could be that lonely, and we just shouldn't take our communities for granted, for sure. Okay, yeah, I'm done.
No, you're right. I mean, I agree that I think the greatest suffering that we experience in this lifetime or world is the disconnection. And that's exactly what you're talking about, that what really makes a community is connection. And you can feel it when you were growing up, and I felt it when I was growing up, as Anita, you did too. And so that's really crucial. It's very crucial. Yeah. Well, I will get started, and I think we'll take a break in a few minutes, but just let me know when it's time. So the physical environment, I don't take for granted my physical environment. I try very hard to really appreciate what I have. I don't have much, but I have enough. I have a little bit there, and I like to plant and like to live in the garden and do work there, and it's a form of meditation for me. And the physical environment is so crucial to all of us. It usually reflects the place, including the human-made physical components, the design, the permitted use of space. Can we go there or not go there? And the natural environment that's around us, hopefully, and the natural environment that needs to be around us. It also includes transportation which also increases our mobility or decreases our mobility if it's not there, it's not present or accessible. What's sold and how it's promoted, the parks, the green space and open space, the look and feel, the air, the water, soil, and the arts and cultural expression are all part of our physical environment. Environmental racism is caused by several factors, including intentional neglect, the alleged need for a receptacle for pollutants in urban areas, and a lack of institutional power and low land values of people of color. The environmental racism impacts the health of the communities affected by poor environments. Various factors can cause health problems, such as exposure to hazardous chemicals, toxins in landfills and rivers, and also exposure to those toxins can weaken or slow our own brain development. When I was growing up in Pittsburgh, the steel mills were rampant here. And I can remember my father worked he's an engineer working for H.J. Heinz, but he would come in from the city from home at night. In the morning, he'd leave in with a white shirt. And in the evening, he'd come home and his shirt was literally gray. And I can remember the color gray until they finally eventually closed the mills in Pittsburgh, which transformed Pittsburgh in many different ways, socially, culturally, economically, and so forth. But that environmental pollution was prevalent. And when I went to Pitt as a freshman, I have allergies and asthma, and I can remember having a difficult time breathing because I was so close. I was closer to the steel mills there than where I lived at home. So our environment does play a part in our health. Is it time?
Yeah, it's time for a break.
Yeah.
So we'll take that break now, and then we'll come back and continue what you were talking about. I'm your host, Anita Russell, and we have been discussing racism is a disruptor of health and wellness and mind, body, and spirit. And our question has been, what would it take to live a good life and create a vibrant society? So I'm going to hand the mic over to Gail so she can pick up where she left off.
Well, I was talking about how environmental injustice can contribute to the disparities in health. It also, environmental justice calls for universal protection from nuclear testing, extraction, production, and disposal of toxic, hazardous waste that are poisoning our waters. And also in the nuclear testing that threatens a fundamental right to clean air, land, water, and food. Championed primarily by the African Americans and Latinos and Asians and Pacific Islanders and Native Americans, the environmental justice movement addresses a statistical fact. People who live, work, and play in America's most polluted environments are commonly people of color and low income. Environmental justice advocates have shown that this is no accident. Communities of color, which are often poor, are routinely targeted to host facilities that have negative environmental impacts. There was Warren County in North Carolina was actually a very strange place for the environmental justice to begin, but that's where it actually did begin. When the county decided that it was going to be a very positive location to dump 6,000 truckloads of soil laced with toxic PCBs. And all of a sudden, that county became very popular nationwide, because what happened was as they were beginning to take the dump trucks to the site in the September of 1982, many people from the community and beyond came and laid down in the street in front of the trucks so they couldn't cross. So they began their protesting for a period of time. The sad thing is that it didn't work. They still ended up with that dump site. However, what did come from that was the beginning of this justice movement towards anti-racism and towards healthy, clean environments for all. And so in 1983, the General County Organization of the government study was published, and it also revealed that 3/4 of hazardous waste landfill sites in 8 southeastern states were located in primarily poor African American and Latino communities. In 1990, several environmental justice leaders co-signed a widely publicized letter to the Big Ten environmental groups, accusing them of racial bias in policy development, hiring, and the making of their boards, and challenged them to address the toxic contamination in the communities and workplaces of people of color and the poor. As a result, some mainstream environmental organizations developed their first environmental justice incentives. They added people of color to the staff and resolved to take environmental justice into account when making policy decisions. The leaders that also pushed their agenda within the government. And in 1990, a group of prominent academics and advocates within the movement sent letters to Louis Sullivan and William Riley. The letters requested meetings to discuss needed government action. Sullivan, who was African American, ignored the letter, but Riley accepted the offer. And later that year, he met with a group, a session that led to the creation of the United States EPA's Office of Environmental Equity. In October of 1991, the growth of the environmental justice movement became very evident. And when there was a summit that was formed, and the summit produced the Principles of Environmental Justice and a Call to Action, which are two foundational documents of the environmental justice movement. And as wonderful as that sounds, in 2021, there's an environmental integrity project that showed that there were 12 months of the monitoring project, which concluded in December. They found that benzene levels exceeded EPA action levels. In this one area, 57% of the 530,000 residents who live in nearby communities are people of color, and 43% of these community members live below the poverty line. So things have changed, but there's still systemic racism that's still existing. And one of the terms that they use that I found is that they call it redlining. And they redline different neighborhoods that are more lower income. They're more usually of Latino or African American. And they pick these areas of being perfect in order to create a dump or to create a way of polluting and in some way, whether it's nuclear, whether it's on toxic waste. And so there's still so much more work that has to be done in really improving the environment for all people. And I mean, I go around when I drive around the city here, I can see different signs that say no towers for the towers that fuel our cell phones, right? And because there are studies out that indicate that can be very dangerous. But that means that needs to be present for everyone. There has to be a different solution that I think we all together collectively have to come up with. So transportation was the other area that I was to talk about. And the environment, transportation is part of the environment. Transportation consists of a network and services and infrastructure that's necessary for residents to get from one place to another. When it's designed well, transportation can promote safe mobility and is accessible to all residents, regardless of geographic location or age or disability status. Unsafe transportation can result in unintentional injuries or death. Access or lack of access to quality transportation and services, such as healthcare, education, and social services, can also be very difficult to get to. There's another term they call active transportation, which complements the public transportation. And it's actually a form of transportation that reduces the environmental barriers to physical activity and promotes positive health outcome, such as bicycling and the bike lanes that some cities have actually put in place to create a safe way for people to commute into their jobs and into the city. The transportation can also have some negative environmental impacts, which is something we all are more of them aware of with the gas prices going up, but it's also the toxins that come from the automobiles. So this is a major issue for everyone. What I see happening in many areas is that it's a much greater issue for people that live in lower income, that where the neighborhoods are more predominantly African American or Latino or Asian, and that they have little access to that transportation. One of the things I read in the local paper in Pittsburgh that I think different communities have already instituted and Pittsburgh's looking at doing is offering free public transportation to certain groups of people, such as people from lower incomes, students, elderly people, and making it more accessible, having more bus routes to for people to access, and to make sure that it's the bus stops are safe environments that are well lit and so forth, that can help and encourage people to actually use that transportation. By ensuring opportunities for minority and low income communities to influence the transportation planning and decision-making process, they can enhance engagement and develop more meaningful input. The transit equality improves the dignity and the transit user experiences, reduces pedestrian and bicycle injuries and fatalities. And so think about if you had to use public transportation, you would want it just as you would want your roads and the areas on the roads to be clean and free of debris. You also want your transportation system to be that way too. So it's important to look at all aspects of what everybody certainly is deserving and needing. What I learned from a lot of this, I know I'm running a little bit over, but is that in order to change the environmental issues and the transit issues, they have to begin to use more connectedness with one another. They have to use the people that are in the neighborhoods themselves to be part of the policy making and plans, right? And there has to be more cohesiveness so that affordable access to transportation for seniors, for lower income students will be available to everyone, and that everyone participates in what they want in their environment and what they want and need for transportation. I think that's crucial to being collectively more connected to a variety of different, whether it's an agency, government, organization, or planning, but planning is important.
Excellent, excellent, Gail. Thank you for that summary. I think one of the things that really kind of jumped out at me, and again, it kind of links into some of what Mavis was talking about, is this whole idea of fostering multi-sector collaboration. I mean, in the information that you just presented, there were multiple facets involved in all of that. It takes a lot of effort from a lot of different people and a lot of different agencies and all of that. But when you foster that multi-sector working together collaboratively, that's when you can really, really start to see some important changes across the board.
Right, and it's not that different than what Mavis you were saying with when we separate ourselves and we're disconnected, we don't have the ability to really have a vital life. And the same thing with these issues, that when we are more collaboratively working together and from various agencies or groups or people, especially people in the community, then we have a far greater chance of really creating a more consistent change.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we're going to flip over to the last topic, the last social determinant of health, which is education. Now, this is one that really, really fits close to me. I have done, for example, a homeschool program years ago. And so just sort of built this program that was geared towards my children. We formed a homeschool co-op with another family. And for 4 years, we basically educated our own children. This is why we had jobs and all of that. But it was because of some factors that were going on in their previous educational systems that weren't necessarily working in the way that we needed them. So we kind of took it on ourselves, which was very interesting. It was a very interesting 4-year period of my life. But I learned just as much in working with the girls. There were 4 of them that that they learned from me being their teacher. I was their math and science teacher. So it was just kind of an interesting time for me, and it really helped me to greatly appreciate education. So when you think about the concept of education, education is about a process and a product. So it's a process in the sense that education occurs everywhere, whether you're at home, whether you're in school, in the community, whether your community, somebody else's community, you're in the store, whatever. There's some sort of education or learning that is going on, particularly when you think about kids when they're little. Like the world, the life is a learning playground. Like I have my 2-year-old grandson, Cairo, and his very existence is a learning experience. So it's just a beautiful thing to kind of watch. But also as a product, and education is the sum total of your knowledge, your skills, your capacities, intellectual, social, emotional, physical, productive, interactive. It's all of that. It's that sum total of who you are as a person. Your education can be formal. It can also be experiential. But there are two things that don't sit really well with me when it comes to education. So you can kind of look at it from this sort of grand kind of space, and just acknowledging that your level of educational fulfillment or attainment can actually influence your health. It can influence your behaviors, employment, income, social and psychological, and all of those types of things can be tied directly into your education, okay? And so the two things that don't sit well with me as it relates to the topic at hand around racism being a disruptor of health and wellness are adultification bias and its close relative, the school to prison pipeline. So if you joined our session, in our last session, I talked about the little 6-year-old girl from Florida who had been arrested because she was misbehaving in the classroom. And it turns out that she had a medical condition. She suffered from a sleep apnea. And one of the symptoms for children with sleep apnea is that they may exhibit disruptive behavior because they're sleep deprived. And so you kind of had these circumstances that all came together, and the little girl misbehaved in the classroom, but instead of it being handled like, you know, Gail Mavis and I were talking about how different things were when we were younger versus now. It wasn't the kind of thing where the police needed to be involved, but the police were involved, and the little girl, 6 years old, ended up being arrested. And so that, I mean, I don't see how that can sit well with anybody. And so you could look at that and see how easily it is for these pieces of the school to prison pipeline to kind of snap together. So I'm going to read you a couple of definitions just so we're kind of on the same page. So this definition of the school to prison pipeline is actually coming from the Anti-Defamation League. The school to prison pipeline refers to school policies and procedures that drive many of our nation's school children into a pathway that begins in school and ends in the criminal justice system. Hence this little girl, 6 years old, misbehaved in school, and next thing she knows, she's zip tied, her wrists are zip tied, she's being placed in a police car, driven to the police station, and fingerprinted and a mugshot taken. You want to talk about adultification?
Right.
Okay. And so behavior that once led, this is what the point we were making, behavior that once led to a trip to the principal's office or calling your parents or detention now results in suspension, expulsion, and in this little girl's case, it led to arrest. So now let's talk a little bit about adultification. So there might be people out there who have never heard of that term, but if you look it up, there's so much information out there about that and how that term ties into a little 6-year-old girl getting arrested, how it ties into suspension rates, how it ties into expulsion rates in schools, and all of that as a function of race and gender, okay? So I'm going to read the definition, and this definition actually comes from a woman by the name of Janine Davis, and she is one of the UK's leading specialists in the safeguarding of Black children. So I picked somebody outside of the United States just to demonstrate that this is not just a problem that is centered in the United States. It's centered around these racialized environments that exist in different places around the world. So her research explores how to safeguard responses to Black children when harm is outside of the home. So the definition that shows up in her work is that adultification bias is where children are perceived as being more adult-like and where they are seen through a lens of deviancy and not necessarily acknowledged as deserving victims. And where their innocence, this is the part that really gets to me, their innocence and their vulnerability is erased over time. The preconditions of adultification are based on various biases which intersect, such as systemic inequalities, and where certain communities, particularly from Black communities, are pathologized and considered an other, and therefore not necessarily seen through a lens of safeguarding. And so when you look at some of these racialized stereotypes, they are rooted in slavery, number one, but Black children are then not afforded their innocence. So they're perceived as being older, they're perceived as being streetwise, like all these perceptions. Meanwhile, they're just children. And so somewhere along the line, that just really began to become much more prominent as we moved into these spaces where now you have police officers, school resource officers that are in schools, but they're not trained necessarily. At least I can speak to this gentleman who arrested this little girl, obviously was not trained in how do you deal with a child and without arresting her. And the follow-up report to the little girl is that she now suffers from PTSD. There's been a shift in her as a result of that trauma. There's been a shift in her where she's not as outgoing, like she's her caregiver is her grandmother, and just this idea of how different she is now as a result of that. Okay, so now I'm going to switch a little bit over to some work that was actually done in looking at Black girls in Allegheny County. Gail and I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is a part of Allegheny County. So again, when I read some of this, you can see that connection between the education and the school and this whole thing with adultification bias and how that's connected to the school to prison pipeline. So nationally, Black girls are referred to the juvenile court 3 times more often than white girls, but Black girls in Allegheny County are referred to the juvenile court at a rate of 11 times. So this indicates that there's a problem here in the city of Pittsburgh. And if you know the history of the city of Pittsburgh, some of the things that Gail, that were mentioned earlier by Gail and Mavis, for example, gentrification is a big deal in the city of Pittsburgh. Low school performance, inadequate schooling, and things like that are big deals in the city of Pittsburgh. So then when you add on some of these things that we've already talked about, the social environment, the physical environment, and now you're talking about the educational environment. And the report goes on to say that many delinquent behaviors, which are normal adolescent behaviors, but because racism, sexism, poverty, and living in low income neighborhoods are present, that presence makes some young people more likely to come to the attention of police and system officials than others. And so when you think about all of these things in combination to one another, when you think about the school to prison pipeline, you think about adultification bias, you think about, the environment, all of these things that are having a very negative impact on us as a society. So for me, when I look at this from a social perspective, it doesn't really matter whether it's this group or it's that group. The fact of the matter is every group needs to be taken care of. Our children need to be taken care of. The school to prison pipeline shouldn't even exist. It didn't always exist. So how do we get back to a place where that kind of thing doesn't exist anymore? And so I think about this in terms of increasing community capacity to shape the outcomes. In other words, we can do something different as a community that creates a completely different outcome. And some of the things that we've already talked about here, that's what I like, these social determinants of health and the work that was done in these communities and action and all of that, because it shows you that it can be done. Okay, so we are literally just about out of time at this point. And what I really like for the audience to walk away with is this, that we can collectively put our faith. I've said this before. Gail and Mavis has said this before. We can collectively and collaboratively put our faith and our energy and our drive in a different future. If we can believe that we can create a different future that leads to a more vibrant and equitable society, then that Cairo question again gets resolved. Will Cairo have to protest for his birthright to peacefully exist in the skin in which he was born? And the key to that is birthright, because we all should be entitled to be able to live peacefully in the skin in which we are born without these external factors that just add this whole entire other dimension on our lives and the lives of our children. So I'm going to leave you with this final quote, and it's from Thomas Merton, a monastic monk. Love is our true identity. We do not find the meaning of life by ourselves alone. It is with one another. And so I leave you with those words and those words of encouragement to think differently, to think very, very differently as you walk throughout the course of your life. And that pretty much ends our show. So this is Anita Russell on Inflection Point Podcast on Transformation Talk Radio. We are here every first and third Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. I thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you for listening to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. The journey towards anti-racism and social change doesn't stop here. Truth, reconciliation, and healing come from ongoing, open, honest, and deliberate conversations. Continue to dive in and deconstruct your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs as we band together to manifest social change. Tune in to Inflection Point Podcast every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, here on TransformationTalkRadio.com for more conversations about how we can cultivate change from the inside out.